Thank you. Bonjour à toutes et à tous. Welcome to our webinar about the cybercrime and the industrialization of the cybercrime and the evolution of the cybercrime syndicates. My name is Khaled Zekri. I'm a lead security architect with VMware, and we are delighted today to have Rick McElroy, our principal cybersecurity strategist from VMware Carbon Black. Rick has 24 years of information security experience, educating and advising organizations on reducing their risk posture and tackling through the security challenges. As United States Marine, McElroy works included physical security and counterterrorism services. His current role takes him all over the world, working with organizations to improve their security strategies and speaking on behalf of the security and privacy. So welcome, Rick, to the webinar.
Thanks, Haley. Thanks for having me.
Thank you. And we're going to start the presentation, but before starting the presentation, we would like to make this webinar more interactive. So we would like to have your opinion, guys, and your feedback on some of the questions that are related to cybercrime. So let's start with the first questions about the cybercrime. Have you been a victim of a cybercrime in the last 12 or 18 months? So if you have been in that case, answer yes, no, or I don't know. So we have answers coming, and
it's exciting to watch the poll voting, by the way, Haley. This is exciting.
Yeah, absolutely. So we are 60% of the answer, and the results are quite interesting, actually. So 73%. Let's have 15 seconds. Okay, so let's share the results here. So as we can see here, there is 50%, let's say 50% yes, 50% no, and yeah, half and half yes and no, and 30% they don't know. So yeah, what's your feedback on these results, Rick? So
yeah, I think that's probably about accurate. If I polled 100 people in an audience, look, I think some of us have probably been victims and don't know yet. Maybe that data is out there. Maybe the companies haven't notified us. Notifications for breaches have, over the last 5 or 6 years now been mandated, right? So we're starting to find out a little bit more about it. And yeah, this seems about right based on everyone's threat reports and the numbers that we see overall.
Yeah, absolutely. So that's very interesting, because there is still the culture of people that are maybe a victim of cybercrime, but they are not willing to talk or not willing to share. We start moving from that mindset because of more and more companies are interested to collaborate and protect themselves from cybercrime. But yeah, that's a good feedback. Okay, so Rick, let's talk a little bit about the history of cybercrime. If you can tell us a bit more about the history and what's going on.
Sure. Let me share my screen real quick.
Yeah.
I'm on the right desktop. All right, now we're up and running. Yeah, so I always find one of the things I get to do in my role is actually spend some time looking at these problems, really taking, a macro level picture, gathering information from lots of sources. And I thought this is an interesting place to start, which is the first recorded cybercrime took place in 1820, which I always think is super interesting because a lot of times we think the history of cyber, really the genesis comes out of the 70s and the 80s. In the 90s, everybody plugging in, and then of course the 2000s where we started hacking all of the things. But it goes back, much, much further than that. And this was an interesting case. It was actually a textile manufacturer in France who produced a loom. The employees were not happy about their jobs being automated and took some insider malicious behavior that became destructive. And that is now known as the first cyber crime in history. But what I wanted to do during this particular discussion is to fast forward a little bit in the history of cyber from the 1800s to right around the year 2000. And I think there's some important milestones that we need to look back on to understand how these cyber cartels have gotten more affluent and the tactics that they're actually using, which you can see from the history of cybercrime, that what they really do is build upon other groups, they build upon other technologies. And so I thought a couple that I wanted to point out today. Shadow Crew. If you're not familiar with Shadow Crew, simply put, you can think of Shadow Crew as a cybercrime forum and marketplace. The structure of the marketplace review system and other innovations really began when Shadow Crew laid the basis of today's underground forums and markets. So they happened to be first, and everybody kind of copied what they were doing. A lot of today's scams, right? So when you look at some of the techniques, tactics, and procedures that Shadow Crew used, a lot of the scams and computer crimes really began with this particular group. The site opened in around 2002, flourished, and then fell off in 2004, which is actually a repeated pattern amongst cyber criminal groups. They form up, they make a bunch of money. Sometimes they go away because they don't need to take the risk anymore. Other times they splinter off into various groups. Also wanted to point out things like 2004, a 50% increase in malware that was seen. 2005, the Botmaster Underground, which was one of the first, named bot networks that were out there. It was a million hosts, right? It moves us towards the idea of anonymous hacktivism, the rise of anonymous. A lot of us are familiar with anonymous versus Scientology, going after that data, doing distributed denial of service attacks. Those groups inside of Anonymous started to splinter a little bit as well. They started to have other ideologies. 2010, we saw the rise of the Zeus Trojan. So that's a malware package that runs on Windows, and it can be used to carry out a bunch of different tasks. And so what you started to see is what we call modular-based malware. So these toolkits. You also saw the rise of Emotet right around this time as well. LulzSec was important. LulzSec sort of hearkened in the end of an era for Anonymous, right? So if you're familiar with the LulzSec case, the FBI infiltrated one of the groups inside of Anonymous and then arrested them and did a bunch of takedowns associated with that crime group. 2013, CryptoLocker, very famous from a ransomware perspective. And I would say this was really the dawn of the modern ransomware era. 2015, ransomware as a service gets stood up. So you saw the first cyber criminals that are now standing up as a service offerings on the dark web to allow other people to pay them to launch ransomware types of activities. 2016 was named the year of ransomware by the Federal Bureau of Investigations. Very quickly on the heels of that, we saw Petya. We're going to actually talk about one of the groups behind, not Petya and WannaCry as we go through this. We can all remember the destructive attacks that occurred across the globe as a result. A spree of universities start getting hacked in around 2018. In fact, there's been too many to mention since 2018 that have been hit. They have a very wide attack surface, a lot of legacy gear, and a whole lot of open access. Access mining was identified by the Carbon Black threat analysis unit in 2019. Subsequent to that, we've seen many, many cybercriminal marketplaces that offer access mining. Access mining, simply put, can be considered me as an attacker landing on your endpoint and then offering to sell that to someone else. And they do a whole bunch of things like classify the endpoint. They're able to do asset listings, the type of memory, the type of GPU involved, and then they'll sell those for various reasons, whether that's going to be cryptojacking or actually using it as a botnet, which takes us to 2020. And what I like to refer to as a pandemic of extortion that occurred alongside of the global pandemic. whether that was a rise of 400%, from our Federal Bureau of Investigations that sort of said, hey, there was a 400% increase in the number of phishing campaigns that were occurring across the globe. I think all of us who have been in a defensive seat during this pandemic have felt that. And what does this actually all mean? Well, what it means is that cybercriminals are costing the global economy $2.9 million every minute. And I wanted to pause there for a second because that's a massive number, 2.9 million every minute. I mean, think about this from an organization perspective. If your organization generated $2.9 million a minute, you would be a wildly successful organization. And I think everybody in that company would be happy. So what does this all mean from a macro level? Well, what it means is these techniques, tactics, and procedures, the lack of defensive on our side, the lack of rules in place from a regulation perspective, frankly speaking, law enforcement being overworked and not enough of them, has equaled a $1.5 trillion cyber criminal market. And that's pretty startling, Aleb.
Yeah, wow, amazing. I learned a lot. And it's crucial to understand that the impact of cybercrime and the impact on the economy and on the organization as well. So we talked about the law and the regulation. I would like to share another poll question about the regulation. So yeah, let's gather information from the audience about the regulation. So we know that in the European Union, France and other countries, they have strengthened their cybersecurity regulations. How do you perceive the new regulations? And you can make multiple choice here. So does the regulation help you to increase your cybersecurity challenge? Or do you perceive a standardized security control framework that help to build a zero trust security? The regulation could be also a challenge for the business and could limit the market expansion. And compliance to regulation will help you to securely consume digital service.
Hey, while we're responding to this poll, Halem, I also wanted to point out the $1.5 trillion market. That sounds like a huge number, but let me put that in a little bit of a frame of reference for folks. If you added up the revenues of Microsoft, Apple, Amazon, and Walmart, their annual revenues do not exceed $1.5 trillion. That's a pretty powerful market. And we're going to talk about the implications to organizations from that.
Exactly, yeah. So we are at 65% of the voters, so please continue voting, and I will stop the poll in 2, 3, 1. Let's share with the result. Yeah, interesting. How do you
think that's interesting? I would say I'm assuming that most of the people on this call are information security professionals, right? And we never let an opportunity go to waste. And so I do believe that while compliance can impact security negatively, if we err on the side of compliance over security, I also believe that as new regulations comes out, it gives us an opportunity to increase what we're doing from a cybersecurity perspective, to have those conversations with our legal staff, our general counsel, our CEOs and our CFOs. And so, yeah, I would think about upcoming regulations the same way too, which is how can I increase what I actually need, which is generally budget and people to actually meet the need that's out there.
Absolutely. So we can retain that the regulation mainly put the cybersecurity at the highest priority for the budget, but also make the customers, your customer guys, more confident in consuming your digital services. So okay, so let's move on, and if we would like to talk about the regulation and the laws, what needed to help toward this rising threat to people and organization?
Yeah, well, there's a number of different things, right? A lot of this stuff is outside of an organization's control, outside of a CISO's control, outside of the SOC team and the operator's control. And so I think Look, one, I believe that a global discussion needs to happen, and it needs to happen now from a governmental perspective. We need to start to put resources behind doing some of these takedowns, which we've seen places like the EU. They simply put, they're doing a better job of taking down some of these nefarious networks than we are in the States. And so look, there's a law enforcement component to this, which is there's only so many law enforcement folks that are trained in cyber. So we have a training gap. And then simply put, there are too many issues to investigate. And so law enforcement is generally focused around the largest breaches, the ones with the splashiest numbers associated with it. And so oftentimes as organizations and defenders, we're left on our own. And so does that mean that we can't rise to that challenge? Absolutely not. In fact, one of the other areas that we see often from these cyber criminals is that they're fairly lazy, and they like to automate a few things, and it does provide some opportunities for us to interrupt what they're doing. I think secondarily, we need to all understand how these markets actually work. And so when I talk about cybercrime as a market, I actually talk about it the same way I would the technology market, the healthcare market, all of these different things. And so what you see from a criminal perspective out there, so we talked a little bit about ransomware as a service. There are tons of other as a service cyber criminal offerings that are out there. Phishing as a service. Someone will write you a piece of 0-day and new code as a service. Essentially, you don't have to be an expert at writing code anymore to pull off these attacks. The other thing that the cyber criminal groups are doing is forming affiliate programs. And I'm going to talk a little bit about those affiliate programs when we get to one of the particular groups that we're going to do an overview on today, because I think they were sort of the pioneers and godfathers of that behavior. And then as we've observed over the history of cybercrime, other criminal groups are going to mirror that behavior and mirror that sophistication and continue to push these attacks. So again, I did want to reiterate that the bar for entry on some of these very splashy, large headline-based attacks isn't that you have to be a nefarious hacker with a hoodie. It's that I have Bitcoin and I have access to the dark web. We can find one of these marketplaces and buy one of those services.
Yeah, absolutely fantastic. So thank you, Rick. And by the way, I would like to tell the audience, if you have any question, please ask your question in the Q&A section, and we will answer to them during the session. So, Rick, you've talked about the history and the size of the economy. Can you talk to us about the tactics involved along with, some of the major players here?
Yeah, absolutely. Because again, I do think it's important. And look, while the names of these groups will change over time, will grow over time, the techniques, tactics, and procedures that they're employing, they're either first to market on those or they're copying someone else's. So I think this is an important discussion. But the one I'm going to start with, some of us out there may be familiar with this group, some of us may not. Sandworm. Their computer attacks use some of the world's most destructive malware to date. If you look at anything happening in the Ukraine, you can be assured that Sandworm is associated with it. NotPetya, which caused $1 billion worth of losses. The Olympic Destroyer, I think some of us remember that, which were really around attacks launched in South Korea during the Olympics. They basically have the reputation as the most dangerous team out there that are performing some of this stuff. Why? They will go destructive in a heartbeat. Not every criminal group will do that. Some criminal groups have decided to, especially during a pandemic, to not hit folks like hospitals, right? So they do have a bit of a moral and ethical code that varies depending on the group. Sandworm was named and shamed by our Federal Bureau of Investigation, and an indictment was served in October 2020. Now, that was October 2020. We all know, to actually serve an indictment, you have to have people in the country, right? So some of this, was probably done from a media perspective, but I think it's important. Look, we were able to put a face and an identity to this, and I did want to point out, if you want to learn any more about Sandberg, please go read Sandworm, A New Era of Cyber War and the Hunt for the Kremlin's Most Dangerous Hackers by Andy Greenberg. It is a fantastic book, and we'll get into the entire history of this group. Now, what you see with Sandwarp is a whole lot of influence on other groups. So the next group I wanted to talk about is Maze, aka Telebots, Voodoo, Bear, Hades. Look, there's a lot of advanced persistent threat actor names associated with Maze. But this is what I wanted to talk about, the way that they work. So Maze started the affiliate partnership program, right? So essentially they would work with other ransomware teams, other cyber criminal teams to do various parts of the attack stages. So that initial access brokering, we kind of talked a little bit about that. The lateral move components, the encryption components. These affiliates will handle different phases of that attack, eventually landing in the Maze cartel itself, distributing the ransomware, encrypting boxes, and then brokering those connections. But you'll often see, Ragnar Locker associated with this group. Conti is associated with this group. I think I mentioned Ragnar Locker, Suncrypt, Lockbit. Now, what's very interesting about the Maze ransomware group is they came out and made a statement to the press that said the Maze group never existed, and it was simply built by the press. We can say that's not true because their malware has been observed in the wild. They've actually received funds from that, but they did say that they're going out of business and they're going to stop, acting as if they're the Maze cartel, which probably means there was some infighting, and at some point one of those groups is going to spin off. Because frankly speaking, when we look across our customers, right? So this data comes, from our incident response teams, from surveys that we've done, from all of these things. And what we've seen is a 40% increase over the last year in double extortion. Now, Maze is one of the groups credited with a double extortion scheme. Now, what do I mean by that? They land a piece of ransomware on a system, but they don't encrypt it yet. What they're doing is gathering information on your network. Maybe that's a business email compromise where they're now living inside of your Exchange servers, looking at communications flowing inside of the organization, looking for other data. They then grab that data and they go on a public market. So each one of these groups has websites associated with it, has marketplaces, and they'll name and shame the companies. So as an example, if it was VMware, they would say, hey, VMware, we have some of your source code. We're demanding X amount of dollars in payments. And the sad part about all of this is now extended to customers and patients of hospitals. We've seen cases where patients were extorted based on information that they had given their doctors or their healthcare providers across the globe. We've also seen customers now being pulled into this. So, so what'll happen is the attackers will get access to your customer records, and they'll start emailing your customers to tell them that they're demanding these extortion payments. And you should reach out to the company and demand that as well. And I think that level of sophistication, that level of negotiation when it comes to extortion is unparalleled.
Yeah.
The third group I'll briefly mention, Haleb, is around REvil, right? So the interesting things about REvil is that they actually put a recruitment drive for other hackers out on the internet. It looks like a Craigslist on the dark web. So, and with $1 million in Bitcoin associated with that. Think about that. If a company, if an Apple, if a Facebook, if VMware decided to put a bounty out on defenders and incident responders at $1 million, I mean, that's pretty significant. You're going to recruit some talent when you put that money behind it. They've been responsible for a bunch of ransomware sprees across the United States and across the globe. Most recently, in fact, this week, there's a bunch of drama associated with REvil. Why? They're saying that they have schematics and source code on the new MacBook that's going to be put out, right?
Wow.
They're also saying, and what's interesting is they went from asking for things like $1 million in extortion to $50 million in this case. Today, I believe it was today or late yesterday evening, they actually removed those posts. So it's unclear as to whether or not they were engaged and paid a ransom, or if it was unclear that one of their affiliates did not actually have that data, the data it was purported to be. But in either case, Apple winds up in the news again because of the attempted extortion. I know I've talked about a whole lot, Caleb, and I've introduced a lot of groups, but this is going to be the last one that I wanted to introduce today. There's an important reason that I wanted to talk about plot. This is considered the big game hunting cartel. This is considered the group that spends a lot of time upfront during their reconnaissance to identify people who are most likely to pay. And not only are they most likely to pay, but they're going to pay the biggest extortion that's out there. They sprung on the scene right around June of 2020, and they have not stopped since. Recent victims include Shell, Qualys, Flagstar, Jones Day, Stanford University, and the University of California, along with a bunch of others. But here's the important thing to remember about this group. They have two portals. They have a marketplace portal and a negotiating portal. On this negotiating portal, they have a chat, an interactive chat where they'll help you and answer your questions, whether that's getting your data back and decrypted or actually buying Bitcoin. They show you demos. They give you the ability to buy Bitcoin through this portal. They have news. And oh, by the way, Caleb, and I thought this is fascinating, there's a whole social marketing section at the end of this portal where they talk about the other attacks that they pulled off. You know, they pull news stories and news links and articles to, again, go out and market those services to other people who would participate in cybercrime.
It's definitely big industry, and it's definitely a big business here. So how hard is it to pull these crimes off?
Yeah, well, look, I mean, when I started back in the 90s, we had to make a lot of this stuff up. You know, the people who could write 0 days were a handful of people on the face of the earth. And so fast forward, now there's, you know, third-party NGOs that are doing this for governments and other organizations that are out there. But generally speaking, when it comes to cybercrime, it's very easy. To purchase access to a mid-sized organization, that's going to run you about $1,000 in Bitcoin, US, on the dark web market. To rent ransomware as a service, $5,000. So you can see the barrier for entry to start generating a return on investment, right? So you've invested $5,000, you want to return on that $5,000 US, is very quick, very easy. And again, they treat this as a business. They have metrics on the victims, right? So they know the
Rick, I think we lost the sound.
How about that? Is that better?
Yeah.
Awesome.
Thank
We
you.
worked around the issue. Sweet. So to exfiltrate data and launch a double extortion scheme, $50,000. However, if on the other side of that $50,000, I can almost be guaranteed I'm not going to get caught for doing the crime, and I'm going to receive $1 million or more, that is a huge incentive for these cyber criminals to continue what they're doing. So remember, it's not about some fancy hacker that's out there. It's about someone who has access to the dark web, someone who has some cryptocurrency, and someone who wants to make a quick buck doing crime.
Fantastic. So yeah, let's get some feedback again from the audience and send the third poll for the session. So what areas are you prioritizing today to facilitate the new work from anywhere world? So is that more focusing on delivering a secure end user environment for employee working from anywhere? Is it about updating the network security to adapt to the new work from home context? What about the enforcement of protection of application on-prem and in the cloud with the move of many of application to the cloud? And also, what about the acceleration of the delivery of new service with the new risk coming, with new context changing? You need more and more security service to deliver to the end user and to protect your apps.
Well, this one's overwhelming.
Yeah. We have quite 60% of voters responding. Okay, so this is the result, and it seems like the majority of the attendees believe that the priority should be on delivering a secure end-user environment for employee working from anywhere. Any comment on that, Ray?
I agree. Look, sending everyone in the world home to work increased our attack surface by infinity. I mean, if you followed any of the blogs that I've put out, since I've been over at VMware Carbon Black, I actually talked about one of these issues back in 2017, which is really around our home routers and the insecurity of those home routers, right? But that's the tip of the iceberg. Then you get inside of home networks. We now have Alexa, Google Home, all of these various IoT devices that are plugged in, and it does create a ripe environment for cyber criminals. My guess will be post-pandemic, as incident response efforts continue and finish, there's going to be a long tail on breaches over 2020 and into 2021. And so a lot of this, we're not even going to find out till the investigations are done. But I would expect to see some pretty splashy stuff around island hopping from home networks.
Yeah, absolutely. So with that overview, we can really start getting a sense as the size and growing scale of this economy. So Ray, what can be done to help disrupt this market? Mainly this question would be interesting for our customers, either they are victim or not.
Absolutely. It's something that I think I spend a lot of time thinking about. I spend a lot of time talking. And look, there's things we can control running a security program, and there's things we can't. I can't necessarily control laws and regulations. I can't necessarily control lack of law enforcement not working together, right? I can't control lack of visibility that doesn't help nations put together the full picture, right? I at the end of the day, can influence, right? I can speak, I can ensure that my legislators and regulators understand these issues so that they craft, better laws. I think, look, a digital Geneva Convention is needed and has been needed for the last 10 years. A lot of this is coming out of sort of this trickle down cyber economy from a cyber arms race perspective. But if you start to simply think about how these attackers work, how they do their business, there is a chain of events that occurs. This chain of events isn't always linear. Sometimes the attackers skip steps. But if we start to think about how they do the business, like when I did this for our United States government and I would attack Department of Defense systems, there's a way that we would work. Now, typically what happens is we don't actually notice the behavior of, say, a ransomware attack until that system tells us it's been encrypted and we get a notification that we have to now go get Bitcoin and pay some. But there was a whole bunch of things that happened that we probably didn't see up front during that attack phase that the attackers were able to utilize. Now they get to the execution phase of their attack, and by then it's too late. So what I think we have to start to do is to start push visibility back as far as we can into what the attackers are doing. And we know, generally speaking, they do two things all the time. They're going to credential harvest once they land on your system. They're going to start to take those credentials and move laterally throughout your environment. We can focus around those two areas. Every single one of these groups are doing and exhibiting those techniques, tactics, and procedures. And so what winds up happening from an attacker perspective is every time I interrupt one of their attack stages, they have to go back and take manual action. Now, if you think about this from the perspective of any QA team or code writing, well, what am I doing? I'm starting to impact their ROI. I'm starting to make it so they have to take manual activity and actually have to think and write new code in my environment to launch that next stage. And if I start to interrupt them at every single one of the stages they're trying to pull off, well, now I've made their job really hard. Now I've actually become a real pain for them. Chances are, a lot of cases, they're going to go after someone else because it's a whole lot easier. But if we do this as a group of defenders, if we start to drive this visibility, prevention, detection, and response back, well, simply put, one mitigation breaks this chain. We do not have to be 100% right all the time. What we actually have to do is get broad visibility into these attacks as soon as we can, move to interrupt them, make the attackers take manual action, and prevent all of the downstream chain activities that these attackers would do. And this is our inherent advantage as defenders. Lots of times we talk about the attackers' advantages that they get. We have two key advantages. One, it's our home field. We built it. We should know what it looks like. We should know normal. Secondarily, we should seize the advantage of being able to interrupt them at any step along this chain to make their jobs harder. Now, it's like, that's great, Rick. That definitely, is some good advice. But if you think about what happens when each organization across the globe starts to do this, when each government, when each defender starts to do this, well, what we've actually done is raise the bar. We're starting to interrupt their ROI model. And I think this is where we need to go after them. We got to go after the marketplaces, and we're going to need our governments and law enforcement to help us do that. But we have to make their jobs harder. It's simply put, it's too easy to lateral move inside of an environment. So what are we doing about it? No, that's great, Rick. You talked a whole lot about stuff. Well, look, essentially, it becomes about the context, right? It becomes about focusing on the identity, because we know, again, credential harvesting, having good visibility into east-west traffic inside of your environment. But these things can't be bolted on. They can't be complex. And so, look, as a vendor, we have a pretty big role to play in this. We have to simplify how security operations look. We have to make sure that these technologies exist as part of technology as they're delivered and not bolted on. And we can start to build this broad context by taking all of these data sources, putting together, and again, looking to those early chain moments that we're missing before we get to execution, disrupting those attackers. And I think if we all start to do that and raise our boats together, we'll start to interrupt that economy. We'll start to make an impact on what the attackers are doing. And we should absolutely make their lives harder, because they're just launching automated attacks, and it's infuriating the amount of money that they're generating as a result.
Yeah, excellent. That's fantastic. And I would like to thank you very much for all the information you shared with us. I learned a lot, to be honest with you, and I think the audience as well learned a lot. I will open for question from the audience. I can see a couple of questions here. Maybe we can address. One of them is quite easy, and it's basically the foundation of why do people commit cybercrime?
I mean, it's the same reason that people commit crimes. There's opportunity. There's a low risk, and when you read, there's a lot of economic factors that go into it, right? So if you take, say, a country like Brazil, Brazil on the dark web market is really known as being a leader in ransomware as a service. They have tons of people that will teach you classes on how to write ransomware and the whole thing. And so what happened? Sent a whole lot of young kids to school to learn how to code and learn cyber, but did not have jobs for them to land in. And so, again, it's the same reasons that you would see anybody go into extortion. But generally speaking, yeah, there's small groups that are paying rent up into these huge groups. So look, I think it just represents modern crime. If I'm gonna, mug someone, I'm not gonna stick a gun in their face to do that. I'm gonna go into their crypto wallet on their laptop and facilitate it that way, because the chances of getting caught are extremely low today.
Yeah, absolutely. I absolutely agree. There's another question. It's more about what role does insurance have to play in all of this?
Huge role. And when you really think about the cost of cyber crimes, well, who bears that burden? Insurers, especially if you have cyber insurers. And so what we've seen from insurers, and I think this is fantastic, is they've actually raised the bar for organizations going to pay and engage with cyber insurance. So your cyber insurer is not only going to ask you to send them what controls you have in place, but they're also going to start to verify that now, right? And so I do think, while I don't think an organization should 100% insure their risk, I do think that the insurers have been helpful to, especially when it comes to working with legal counsel, so that legal counsel understands in an org that you do have to spend money on this. And so it's very helpful for teams to have sort of that external mechanism that tells their internal other leaders, this is the bar you have to hit to get insurance. Awesome. So it is in fact having a positive impact on security out there.
Yeah, that makes sense. Makes absolutely sense. If you don't mind, there is one more question. So how, with regards to the position of VMware in the security market today, what the value from that VMware can bring to our customer to enforce their protection against cybercrime?
Yeah, well, look, I think there's a number of different ways, right? And I'm always happy to talk to folks about, our products, our product offering. But simply put, we think, again, security is too complex. There's too many tools and it's too hard to do. And so fundamentally, those are the areas that we're working on. Now, look, we could talk about machine learning and big data analytics that we perform over behaviors of attackers at VMware Carbon Black. We could talk about next-gen firewalling, WAF, IDS, IPS with something like NSXT, and last line, we could talk about all of these things, right? But I think more importantly, the broad understanding that the teams are really struggling with the amount of tools that they have. Now they're starting to struggle with the amount of data that we're gathering, and we have to facilitate and make all of this stuff easier. And so if anybody wants to follow up, I'd be more than happy to have an intrinsic security conversation with you about the how are we actually impacting those broad areas.
Absolutely. Thank you, Rick, and thank you for the attendees to participate in our webinar. We still have 3 minutes left, so if you have any other questions, please ask in the Q&A section. Well, I think we are all set. We don't have any other questions. So thank you again, Rick, for participating to our webinar. We love hear the cybercrime story from you, and we love learn from you. And I just would like to thank the attendees and the audience, and give you an appointment for the next webinar with VMware and Lisa Sees. Thank you very much. Have a good day.